So as you know, we're in the sermon series on the book of Proverbs that we're calling God's wisdom more valuable than gold. And so far in the series, we've learned how valuable the wisdom of God really is, and how that having the right reverence and respect for God is the very beginning of wisdom. Last week we talked about being wise in friendship. We talked about how important it is that we choose our friends wisely and that we try to be the best of friends as we can be. Today, I want us to be impacted by some general principles and promises of wisdom. We're in another election year, right? And those of us who have been around enough times to know that politicians make a lot of promises that they don't have the ability to keep. Someone has said politicians wouldn't promise the impossible if people didn't expect it. So part of that's our problem, right? I like the story told of this African politician who visited a remote village in his country. And he went into the village there and he said to the village leader, he said, what are the needs of your village? And the village leader said, well, we have a hospital, but we don't have a doctor. And so the politician takes out his cell phone and immediately dials things, and he's talking to somebody on the phone, and he hangs up and he says, a doctor will be here tomorrow. What's the second need you guys have? And the village leader said, well, our second need is cell phone reception. We don't have any cell phone reception in our village. But in contrast to the promises that politicians make and some promises some other people make, God's promises can be counted on because God comes through with His promises. So as we return to the study of Proverbs and as we seek the wisdom of God, I want us to be assured that the principles and the promises of God's wisdom can be counted on. And so today, I want us to look at a number of verses from Proverbs, and I hope that each of us will want to make every effort to get God's wisdom and to put it into practice because of the things that God's wisdom promises. So let's explore these verses filled with some principles and promises of God's wisdom. So in the first sermon from the series, back several weeks ago, we looked at Proverbs 2, 1 through 5. And here we see Solomon string together a number of contingent statements. If you accept my words, if you call out for insight, if you search for it, right? All this effort that has to go into this, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of God. Now, to move on from there into the next few verses, we get the promises. So if you'll do this, you'll get God's wisdom. And if you get God's wisdom, then listen to what Solomon wrote. For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up success for the upright. He's a shield for those who live with integrity, so that He may guard the paths of justice, protect the way of His faithful followers. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and integrity, every good path. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will delight you. Discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you. Which of these promises of God and His wisdom especially resonate with you? Does it resonate with you that if you search for those things, if you ask God for wisdom, He'll give it to you? That's good, right? How about there in verse 7? Do you like that? That success goes with God's wisdom? Now, it doesn't specify what kind of success here in this verse, but success sounds good, doesn't it? But the main promise that jumps out to me most, because it's repeated numerous times in the passage, is there's this element of protection that comes with the wisdom of God. And you may have noticed that, right? There's this protection. There's integrity, and wisdom becomes a shield. Discretion watches over us, and understanding guards us. See, wisdom becomes this force field of protection. That sounds good, doesn't it? I certainly need God's shield and protection, don't you? God's wisdom guards. You want that, don't you? So now let's see how Solomon proceeds to clarify how wisdom protects us, right? So next in verse 12 he writes, "It will rescue you from the way of evil, from anyone who says perverse things, from those who abandon the right paths to walk in the ways of darkness, from those who enjoy doing evil and celebrate perversion, whose paths are crooked, whose ways are devious." Now, I like the way the NIV renders these two verses. Wisdom will save you from the ways of wicked men, from men whose words are perverse, who leave the straight paths to walk in dark ways. So last week we talked about choosing our friends and choosing good friends, friends who aren't into evil, right? And so you can see that this is a way that wisdom protects us from those who are doing what's wrong. So wisdom, God's knowledge teaches us what is right and what's wrong, and who's right and who's wrong, so that we can limit the influence of those who are doing evil. So in that way, God's wisdom shields and protects us from allowing other people to lead us astray down paths of evil and destruction. Now Solomon continues with the very next verses. Verse 16, "It will rescue you," God's wisdom, "it will rescue you from a forbidden woman, from a wayward woman with her flattering talk, who abandons the companion of her youth, forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, her ways to the land of the departed spirits. None return who go to her. None reach the paths of life." And again, the NIV renders verse 16, "It will save you from the adulteress, from the wayward wife with her seductive words." So Solomon's writing this like he's writing it to a son. Son, listen to my words, right? And so for that reason, he frames it in this sense about someone who might be trying to entice his son, this wayward woman. But God's wisdom will also protect daughters from the wayward men, all right? All men and women, whether young or old, needs God's wisdom to protect them from the sexual enticements of wayward men and women. God knows how He's made us, right? God knows how powerful sexual needs and attractions are. And God knows how crafty the enemy is. And how easily we can be taken in by flattering and seductive words. I can make you happy. I've never felt about anyone else the way I feel about you. I promise you today and all the other tomorrows. Promises, promises, promises. Enticements, 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 right? The truth is, anyone who strays from God's ways and designs is headed towards heartache and destruction. What feels good in the moment can have disastrous long-term consequences. But God's wisdom can guard and protect us from all that. So when I was in high school, before Diane and I became a couple, after some of my college years, but when I was in high school, I dated a couple of gals who were trying to lead me into forbidden territories. These gals made it clear that they were available, and one of them even said very clearly, I can make you very happy. I remember saying, but I don't want to be happy. God somehow guarded me and protected me, and I removed myself from those situations and ultimately from those relationships. I severed them. Later in our series, we'll devote a sermon to the subject of being wise about sex and fidelity. Wisdom about that is sorely needed in our time. But as we move into chapter 3, Solomon continues with further promises of wisdom. My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands, for they will bring you many days, a full life and well-being. Never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablets of your heart. Then you will find favor and high regard with God and people. So here we see that remembering and employing God's wisdom brings longer life, well-being. How many foolish things have ended some people's lives earlier than they should have been, right? Wisdom can guard us from that. It can also lead to favor and high regard with God and with people. Obviously with God, right? If we're living the ways God wants us to live, He's going to be happy about that, obviously. But I think if we're living God's ways, employing God's wisdom, I think the majority of people we encounter will also be pleased by that. It'll gain us favor with them as well. The only people who won't appreciate someone who's living according to wisdom and integrity are people who are doing wrong. They may not like that very well. But right after those promises, at the beginning of chapter 3, Solomon moves into some important principles. And some of the most well-known verses from Proverbs are right here in Proverbs 5 and 6 and 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. These are foundational principles, not just in our study of Proverbs, but in our whole relationship with God. First and foremost, our trust needs to be in God and not in ourselves, right? And this is such an important principle. If we think we know enough, or worse yet, if we think we know it all, we're in trouble. God's the only one who truly knows it all, right? And we need His wisdom and we need His guidance. The very best and wisest way that we can live starts with respecting the Lord, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And trusting God with our whole heart. The promise embedded in this principle is that God will make our path straight. When we trust in our own understanding, it's going to lead to a lot of wrong turns, right? A lot of wrong turns, a lot of dead ends. But God knows the way. When we follow His path, it tends to go straighter towards the goal that we're all going towards. Let's jump in chapter 3 down to verse 21. Maintain sound wisdom and discretion, my son. Don't lose sight of them. They will be life for you, adornment for your neck. Then you will go safely on your way. Your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be pleasant. Don't fear sudden danger or ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from a snare. So notice again these amazing promises that come with God's wisdom. They will be life for you. They will also be adornment for your neck. We all need a little bling, don't we? Right? We need some adornment for our neck. God's wisdom will look good on us. That's what he's saying here. It'll be adornment for your neck. It'll be pleasant. It'll look good. It'll make you look good. But more importantly, God's wisdom will give us safety and keep us from stumbling. And one of my favorite promises in here is your sleep will be pleasant. How many of you like a good night's sleep? All right? Yeah, a good night's sleep. when we're walking in God's ways, we can sleep better at night. Why is that? Because we're not worried about when something's going to catch up with us. That shaky place, that crooked path we've taken, when it's going to come back to bite us. And we're not having to look over our shoulder, worried about all the wrong things, because we're not doing any of them, right? So we can lay down at night and our conscience is clear and we can sleep well. But living an ungodly, unlawful life will certainly catch up with a person, right? Those people can't sleep very good at night. Crime and wickedness are profitable in the short term, but usually not in the long term, right? The embezzler eventually gets caught. The crime boss, the gang leader, the drug dealer is going to eventually face justice, or they're going to get taken out by a rival. But in contrast to that, those who walk in God's wisdom and are righteous and honest and law-abiding have nothing to fear. They can stand in God's confidence and they can sleep well at night. The final set of verses that I want us to explore today comes from the last section of chapter 4. So we're moving quickly through chapter 2 and 3 and 4 to grab some of these sections where these promises and principles are embedded. And so in verse 20, my son, pay attention to my words. Listen closely to my sayings. Don't lose sight of them. Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them, and health to one's whole body. Guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life. Don't let your mouth speak dishonestly. Don't let your lips talk deviously. Let your eyes look forward. Fix your gaze straight ahead. Carefully consider the path for your feet, and your ways will be established. Don't turn to the right or to the left. Keep your feet from evil. So Solomon begins this section with some of the commands we've been seeing him say over and over again. Son, pay attention, right? Listen, all right? Don't lose sight of my words. Keep them in your heart. Why? Because they are life. Now notice, it's not just they bring life, they are life. They're life and health. Then Solomon gave a command for the first time that we've run into here in Proverbs. Guard your heart. Guard your heart. And notice he adds, above all else. All right, he's trying to say, pay attention. This is important. Make this a priority. Above all else, guard your heart. And why? Because Solomon says it is the source of life. Ultimately, everything that happens in our lives proceeds from our hearts. Or if you rather, your mind. You know, it's talking about the similar thing, that inner part of us that influences us. Jesus said, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, whatever is allowed to go in to the heart and into the mind is going to have its effect, and it's going to come out. The old computer phrase, right? Garbage in, garbage out. The same thing with our minds and our hearts. Garbage in, garbage out. So we got to keep evil and ungodly thoughts and motives out, and we need to put God's truth and God's wisdom in. So son, listen to these things and put them into your heart and keep them and don't let go of them. Stay on God's paths. So this final principle, let your eyes look forward. Fix your gaze straight ahead. Fix your eyes on God and on God's wisdom. That's an important principle. Stay on God's paths. Don't turn to the right or the left. the NIV in verse 26 says, make level paths for your feet and take only ways that are firm. You don't want to step on those squishy places, those slippery places, those dangers. I don't want to get as close to the edge as I can get. No. Take ways that are firm, that can be counted on, that aren't questionable or slippery. In the end, stepping away from God's ways will not really lead us where we want to go. It'll lead us someplace else. So I hope these verses that we've gathered today, and I encourage you, go back and look at them. I've listed them out there in the handouts. You can go back and look at these sections and meditate on them again. These promises. I hope that all of us will put our full trust in the Lord. I hope that none of us will trust our own understanding, right? That we will think we know more than God or we know better than God. We don't know more than God. We don't know better than God. Don't trust in our own understanding. Trust in the Lord. And I hope we'll always be teachable. We'll depend on God for direction. Dr. Tony Evans, some of you know him well. He's a pastor and an author and a broadcaster. He's been serving a church that he helped plant back in 1976 in Dallas, Texas, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. But he tells a humorous story. He tells it on himself of a time when he was trying to assemble a bicycle for one of his kids. One of those Christmas Eve assembly kind of things, right? And his wife encouraged him to look at the instructions. Thank you, wives. Dr. Evans said, I don't need the instructions. I have a doctorate degree. Surely I can figure out how to put together a kid bike. Dr. Evans wrote, 8 hours later, with only the handlebars on, I decided to consult the instruction manual. How many of us have done that before, right? Oh, I don't need those instructions. I can figure this out on my own. And we wish we started with the instructions, right? Followed each one step by step. There's another story with a similar point about a professional tennis teacher. He was giving his first lesson to an older student. And so after watching this novice, this student of his, take several awkward swings at the ball, the coach began to give him some instructions. This would be helpful, hold this, do this, right? Well, each time he made a suggestion, the older man would immediately critique his suggestion and explain to him why he ought to do it a different way. Well, after several such instructions and corrections from the older man, the tennis professional stopped offering any pointers and began just nodding in agreement with the older student. Well, when that hour-long session was over and the older student left, someone who'd been watching came up to the tennis professional and said, "Why in the world didn't you straighten out that arrogant old man?" And the tennis professional said, "I learned a long time ago that it's a waste of time to try to sell answers to someone who wants only to buy echoes." Are you someone who doesn't really want answers, but only wants echoes? Somebody tell you you're right, whatever you think is right, right? That's a foolish path, right? The wise person says, God is the one who knows. Now, I don't have to be a prophet to predict difficulty and disaster for the person who won't read the instruction manual and who won't listen to the expert. The best place for us to start on this journey of being wise is to acknowledge that God is the wisest of all. He's the expert. He's written the instruction manual. And if anyone will seek God's wisdom, Keep it in their hearts. Follow its directions. Proverbs says they will be blessed. They'll experience life and peace and success. They'll walk in safety. They'll sleep in safety. And they'll be on straight paths. And they'll be protected from the wicked. And they'll also be appreciated by the upright. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Aren't you thankful for the principles and promises of God's wisdom? Keep them close. Never let them go. And be blessed by where they take you. So, Proverbs is an Old Testament, Old Covenant book. But the principle here that we've looked at in Proverbs 3 and verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart, has a unique New Testament, New Covenant application. And that is, we are to trust in the Lord Jesus with all our heart, right? We are to trust Him as Lord and Savior. And most of us here have made that decision to put our trust in Jesus and to follow His ways.